Hey, you're listening to a Bible Brodown podcast, a member of the Trinity Commission. This is where brothers come together to sharpen one another so we can rightly divide the Word of God. I'm Matt.
And this is Billy.
And for the mini, as promised, I'm going to attempt to remember an argument that I came up with for the Trinity that's based on the ontological argument. And this is something that I kind of spent a lot of time thinking about back. I don't remember what we were talking about, but I was Marco Poloing a lot with Dr. Jonathan Pritchett over there at Trinity Radio. And I don't remember what we were saying, what the whole conversation was, but I do remember thinking about how could you prove the Trinity philosophically? Like, is it a necessary part of God's nature or character? Right. And I think it is. So this is the argument. First, like I said, it's building off of the ontological argument. If you're not familiar with the ontological argument, I have not looked at it recently, so if I kind of mess up this explanation, forgive me. There are better ones. Go listen to, type this into YouTube, ontological argument, William Lane Craig, and then, but do that after so I don't sound as dumb as if you listen to it right now and then came and listen to me again. So, but the ontological argument is basically an argument for God, for the existence of God, really from a thought experiment. And it's that the greatest, it is, I prefer it as a definition. It's that God is the greatest conceivable being. And so, and there are different ways of wording it, but the idea that you eventually arrive at is that, well, the greatest conceivable being is not only possible in all worlds, but the greatest conceivable being, a being wouldn't just exist in one possible worlds, but all possible worlds, and the greatest conceivable being would be necessary. And so if the greatest conceivable being is necessary and exists in all possible worlds, then we have to conclude that he is necessarily existing in ours. And so starting from the conclusion of the ontological argument, I started to think, okay, well, if God is the greatest conceivable being, if there is no one greater than him, and we take into account things like he's omnipotent, he is omniscient, he is omnipresent, he is immutable, he doesn't change those characteristics, that nature. He's omnibenevolent, he is all good. How can I prove the Trinity? And I started thinking about, well, what about God being loving? So prior to creation, and we haven't done God in time, so don't roll your eyes at me yet. We'll get there. But prior to creation, or prior to us being around, prior to human creation or angelic creation, prior to beings outside of the Trinity, was God still loving? Could that be an immutable part of his character for if there wasn't anybody around to love?
Right. And
so the solution naturally, I would think, is okay, yeah. That I guess that means that there had to be at least two persons of God, a binitarian God, which is that way we could say that he is immutably, perfectly loving between those two persons of his being, and he doesn't need creation to show that he's loving. He is forever loving, and the greatest possible being wouldn't need something outside of itself to prove that he's loving. So that seems to prove, okay, we got two. How do we get to three? What attribute of God does he consistently apply to himself that would force us to assume that there are three persons in the Trinity, or three persons of God? And I got to thinking, what about unbiased? So if the Father is unbiased, and there's only the Father and the Son, who's he being unbiased with? So necessarily, you kind of need the third person for him to be eternally outside of any relationship with any person or other being. He needs at least three, because the Son can be eternally unbiased what's the word? I guess just unbiased and loving between the Father and the Spirit. The Spirit can be eternally loving and unbiased between the Father and the Son. And the Father can be eternally loving and unbiased between the Spirit and the Son. That seems to be, in my opinion, a pretty strong case for the fact that the greatest conceivable being would have to be at least a Trinity, for it to have these characteristics eternally, because a greatest conceivable being would not need creation or a being outside of itself to have these qualities. The natural question or objection or whatever that I came to after that was, well, what about 4 or 37? Like, why not 500? And there seems to be, I don't know, I hadn't fleshed it all out completely, but the argument, well, Occam's razor, it's the simplest explanation. It is sufficient for 3, and the idea that gluttony or excess is generally seen as negative would mean that if 3 is sufficient, why 4? That seems excessive. There's no reason for it, so there's no need for it. But that, I don't know. Like I said, it's been a while since I thought about that. Billy just brought it up when we were recording the main episode, and so that's off the top of my head how I can remember it. But what do you think, Billy? Any flaws in that, or any fresh thoughts on it?
Part of that makes me think about, by 2 or 3 witnesses, things are confirmed.
Yeah.
How do you know that God the Father, is, like you said, loving or kind or just, etc. And it seems that you need at least 2 witnesses to be able to do that. And and with the Trinity, you have all of those, all those things that are witnessed or verified. And it seems to make sense to me. And that kind of begs the question, is logic and philosophy. Philosophy seems to be like using logic and I don't even know what the formal definition is, but I know logic is involved in it. Can we rely on logic? Is that something that is even something that we should be doing? I mean, it seems that, like, we just went through last week or on Monday, all these quote unquote logical things in who's going to judge us, who created the heavens and the earth, who raised Christ from the dead, who raised us from the dead, and all these points where it shows like the Father, the Son, and the Spirit doing all of these things and taking credit for all of these things. And by logic, we can say that it seems that these are all one. Is that even something that we can do? Because I've heard others say, well, you're using man's logic. And have you heard that, man's logic,
Yeah, that I try not to roll my eyes at things like that. Like, yes, we're using logic, but we know that God is a God of order. And so if we're observing his order and we're realizing, okay, well, based on the fact that he's not going to change the fact that he's orderly, we can make certain assumptions because things aren't going to change. And so that logic just stems from that. It just stems from the fact it just is something that is birthed from observing God, essentially.
Yeah, it seems that God made logic and order part of who we are. Otherwise, when he says, come let us reason together, that he would be telling us to do something that we can't do. And if obviously he can do it better than us, but does that mean that we can't do it with him? Like where he's appealing for us to use our brains and to use logic, like the sun and the stars in the sky, proclaiming him. That seems pretty logical, right? The idea of there's this giant, intricately designed universe seems to have a designer, right? Where this seems like, I should be able to rely on that. But I hear that often, where, well, you're using, your view of logic, not God's, or your view of love, or your view of fairness. And earlier, I mentioned someone talked about God not being a respecter of persons.
Took me a minute to remember where that came from. Yeah.
And it's funny because the way they were using it really was the view of their God is that God wasn't respecting anyone, not being the actual translation or meaning behind the verse is that God is impartial, not that God doesn't respect people like, you have no respect for me. You have no respect my authority.
No respect.
Right. And I just think that's people who they basically start attacking your view of something, right? Like the standard view of something, and saying that God's is different. Like, well, you're using human love or human fairness or whatever. And I just think that's if we can't rely on like what God wrote on our hearts, for instance, like good and evil, etc. We know those can be seared. We understand that, but God gave us these things for a reason, right? And everything seems to be to point to Him and point to His Word and to point to right and wrong, etc.
Yeah, and this is something. So I think this relates really well to the Imago Dei, or the image of God, whether it's a characteristic that is within us or a role that we are supposed to be imaging God. Whichever case you take, it still applies here that God would give us the ability or the means by which to do that. And if He is orderly and He uses reason to come to conclusions, and then if we are in His image, naturally, to some extent, we could do it too. Like you said, not as well as Him, but it makes sense that He is orderly. We live in His world. He made us to be like Him, so we can observe and do orderly, logical things and reason just like He can, not at that level, but in the same way. So yeah, I think it's a pretty safe argument for the Trinity from a philosophical perspective. I don't know if there are others. I hadn't actually looked. But yeah, it's just a fun thing to think about, honestly. I love the heck out of the ontological argument. And again, I use it more as a definition than I do as an argument for why God exists. But maximally great being is something that is pretty easy to... I think I was saying the greatest conceivable being, maximally great being, that being by which nothing greater can be thought. It doesn't matter how you word it. The point is, there ain't nobody bigger, ain't nobody better. And
right.
that's our God. And I think being in a Trinity is necessary and also sufficient for accounting for Him being eternally certain attributes that He claims.
Yeah.
Anything else?
Eventually we'll have it all figured out,
Yeah.
At the resurrection, we'll finally understand what is it that you meant.
Or... people say that, be like, once on the day of judgment, after that, and we're all together, we're in heaven, all our answers are going to be answered. All our questions are going to be answered. And I think about that.
What verse is that?
Well, not just what verse is that, but do I want that? I mean, I don't think we can discover everything there is to discover about God. I think that
right.
That'll take forever. But also, like, that's something that drives people. Learning, investigating, knowing, and who better to want to know and investigate for eternity than God? So I don't think we'll have all the answers, honestly. A bunch of stuff that's here on Earth, because I think ultimately we'll realize, wow, Earth is pretty simplistic compared to what we're about to experience. But
I think we'll have I think this is all think. I don't know. I think we'll have all the answers or pieces relating to like Scripture and like what things meant and why this occurred and what the shadow was of this. Like, why did you do it this way? Well, if you think about it, this is this and this is this and this is this. Oh,
yeah. I guess the counter argument to that is Paul. He says, we see now as if through a mirror dimly. Back then, their mirrors were polished metal. And so they weren't always great. You look in it, you see yourself, but you're like, I think my hair's okay. But he says, then we will see Him as if face to face. And so perfect clarity. So I don't know. We'll see. Either way, it's going to blow our minds. That's my thought.
All right. Well, you guys can find us at BibleBrodown.com. You can email us at BibleBrodown@gmail.com. You can come out to our Facebook group. It's a private group. You can come and request to be added, and we will happily add you. And you can ask us questions there, and we have a lot of good discussion and fellowship there.
Cool. God bless.
God bless.